The Democracy Forum brings you another not-to-be-missed webinar, Britain Looks East, Reorienting Trade Ties. To reduce exposure to US tariff disputes, the UK is turning to Asia, seeking further trade with India, steadier ties with China and wider access to Gulf markets. What will the UK-India Free Trade Agreement mean for services, tech and tariffs? What would a reset with China involve, and could it protect supply chains and exports? Could GCC deals boost investment and digital and energy trade? And how should British businesses weigh up opportunity, risk and resilience across Asia and the Indo-Pacific? To learn more, join our live debate and put your questions and comments to our expert panel.
Welcome. I'm Humphrey Hawksley. This is a Democracy Forum debate where twice a month we discuss and argue issues often overlooked or oversimplified by the mainstream media and commentariat. Britain looks east, reorientating trade ties. 10 years since the Brexit vote, Britain bogged down with its lack of economic growth, grasping for fresh trade and wealth creation. Is Asia the answer? To find out, we have a deeply knowledgeable Democracy Forum panel. George Magnus, Amrita Saha and Prachi Agarwal. Our Democracy Forum chair, Barry Gardiner, is listening throughout and will sum up for us at the end. And before that, I have the privilege to ask the Democracy Forum president, Lord Charles Bruce, to lay out the background and the canvas of our debate. Lord Bruce, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon and welcome to our webinar, which examines the United Kingdom's evolving economic and diplomatic relationships with its trade partners in Asia and the Middle East. I'm grateful to the team at TDF for organizing this event and for arranging for a panel of renowned experts to participate today. We thank them for accepting our invitation and look forward to their individual contributions and to the discussion that follows under the moderation of Humphrey Hawksley. For the United Kingdom government, the reorientation of trade towards Asia and the Gulf countries is a continuing and well-publicized process of negotiated agreements, overseas visits and bilateral meetings. In the last 12 months alone, British trade ministers have concluded free trade treaties with India, with the 6 member states of the Gulf Cooperation Council, and agreed a comprehensive economic partnership with Japan. Deeper trade relations with China were discussed in Beijing in January at the highest level between Sir Keir Starmer and Xi Jinping. And this week, discussions will continue in London with Wang Wentao, China's Minister of Commerce, under the auspices of the Joint Economic and Trade Commission, JETCO. Further agreements connect the UK economy broadly with several rapidly growing economies of the Asia-Pacific region. And for 5 years, Britain has served as a dialogue partner of ASEAN and currently is the only non-Asian participant in the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, the CPTPP. Overall, the total value of trade in goods and services with Asia and the Gulf reached £285 billion last year, around 15% of the UK's total overseas trade. Despite the flurry of trade initiatives that underlie the reorientation of trade to the East, however, the main emphasis for the United Kingdom remains its relationship with China, its 5th largest trading partner, which surpassed £105 billion in total value last year. Although Keir Starmer was granted a few concessions on his trip to Beijing in January, such as reduced tariffs on the sales of Scotch whisky and a mooted professional services agreement, he would have been left in no doubt that the golden era has been reversed, leaving his government with precious little leverage, where trade negotiations are overshadowed by security trade-offs, where China's dominance in a wide spectrum of manufactured goods underlies a real and growing threat of overcapacity, where the UK will have to rely increasingly on the growth of services to achieve any degree of economic autonomy, and where the loss of the collective security of the European Union leaves the United Kingdom uniquely vulnerable to the threat of economic coercion. And commenting on the challenges facing the UK following Keir Starmer's visit to Beijing, President Trump remarked ominously that it was very dangerous to do business with China. Well, thank you very much for deciding to watch our webinar today. And if you have any comments or questions for the panel, please pass them through the chat.
Lord Bruce, thank you very much for that. Dangerous to do business with China. Let's find out. Our first panelist is George Magnus of the Oxford University's China Centre and the School of African and Oriental Studies, and former chief economist at UBS, famously noted for a series of research papers that predicted the 2008 crash. His recent book is entitled Red Flags: Why Xi's China is in Jeopardy. So, should Britain look east? Can it reorientate its trade ties? George Magnus, what are your predictions this time?
Thank you very much, Humphrey, and thank you very much for having me on the webinar. I think just to take the title by the horns, really. The look east part of the discussion, I think, about UK trade has to acknowledge an important point at the outset, which is that we're not going to be able to substitute our trade with the EU and with North America with trade with Asia. We can layer it on top of these commercial structures to supplement and perhaps give us new geopolitical and geoeconomic opportunities at the margin. But I think the key point really is that we are not going to see meaningful booms in export volumes, maybe for some firms at the firm level, but for the UK economy as a whole, we're not going to see a meaningful boom in export volumes or in GDP. Given global fracturing, however, and the wedges that are being formed between different groups, and groups that lean towards the United States and groups that lean towards China and so on, it is, I think, in Britain's interest to build resilience, influence, and geopolitical positioning by trying to exploit new commercial relations. So I think that's an important kind of distinction to make at the outset. Obviously, the second point I wanted to make is that the Indo-Pacific is absolutely key, both in commercial terms and in terms of national security discussions that we've had in the integrated review and defense reviews and so on and so forth. We've had several ministerial visits to China, as has already been pointed out, the resumption of dialogues on different topics, the UK-India Free Trade Agreement, which incidentally has been estimated to yield about 2 to 3 times as much to the UK as the membership of the CPTPP, and even more so with regards to our trade with China. And much could be said the same really for the Gulf, which is almost as important for UK exports in terms of percentages as our trade with China. I mean, to illustrate this, if we look at the CPTPP relationship, it was expected or estimated that it would boost UK's GDP by less than 0.1% per annum. 80% of the trade that we do with CPTPP members, which is Japan, Canada, Singapore, and Australia, all of which have free trade agreements with the UK. So we obviously don't get the tariff benefits from CPTPP because the tariff benefits are already embedded in our FTAs. We also have free trade agreements with South Korea, Costa Rica, Uruguay, and Ecuador, which are all kind of CPTPP wannabes. So the direct commercial benefit for us is not going to be that big. But as I said, there are geopolitical advantages of doing so. India and the Gulf, potentially, I suppose, which others will talk, I think, after me, I think have much more to offer. With respect to China, a couple of points I think I'd like to make. The first is, again, it's absolutely essential to recognize that China is, of course, a trade competitor, but also, unlike most other states, it's a strategic adversary as well. And it's different. With trade competitors, we negotiate often about mutual and shifting commercial advantage. With adversaries, we negotiate really about strategic gains and losses. It's really much more win-lose. China is, of course, a mercantilist nation in which state-directed industrial policies, which are unprecedented in size and scale, and what the American economist Albert Hirschman called power trading, are used to augment state power and deprive or coerce others, as has already been suggested, I think, in Humphrey's comments or Lord Bruce's comments. Obviously, there's considerable competitive advantage which China and Chinese companies have, but this is not the same as the comparative advantage that most trade people think is really important. In other words, you do what you're good at and you import stuff from other countries that are good at doing other stuff. China has some comparative advantage. Mostly what it has is competitive advantage, thanks to the enormous subsidies which are showered by the government and local governments to state enterprises and to also companies that we nominally think of as private firms. Since before COVID, Chinese export volumes have risen by about 50%, but import volumes are barely changed compared with what they were, well, almost kind of 5 or 6 years ago. And so this is quite a serious kind of issue for the world, because it indicates that kind of trade with China is a very kind of loaded phenomenon. China wants to have asymmetric dependency. They want the rest of the world to depend on them while they reduce their dependence on the rest of the world, preaching, as it were, or pursuing policies of national security, as we do, but also much greater and much stronger efforts towards self-reliance. We talk about about China in this country, about being our third biggest trade partner. But the truth is, it's only about 4 to 5% of our exports and about 11 to 13% of our imports, which of course is much bigger. But it has a negligible role to play in our foreign direct investment, either into the UK by Chinese firms or by UK firms in China. So I think it's important to kind of scale this as well, and to look at possible opportunities in other countries where there's much more room for growth. Despite the UK audit policy on China, we are still, I think, at sea. We've lobbied for companies like HSBC and Standard Chartered, for example, when Rachel Reeves went to China a year ago to get access to our Chinese pensions market. But both these banks have supported Hong Kong's national security law, which the British government itself has labelled as damaging the breach a damaging breach of the joint declaration. So we have to really be quite careful, really, about, or much more clear, I think, in terms of our definition of what our China policy is and what's permitted and what's not permitted and what goes against the grain of what we've assessed politically, and what we're prepared to do to allow businesses to grow their own profits with business overseas. What we should be doing, I think, is being much more secure, much more kind of definitive about national security and about what kind of sectors are get clearance and what kind of sectors are restricted, what kind of services we actually are happy to provide to China, for example, tourism or professional and financial services which don't cross national security lines. We have to be particularly careful about what the Chinese call dual-use technology and dual-use products, which are those that ostensibly have commercial and private use, but are either linked directly to the PLA or have access, or the government has access to on behalf of its military. We also need to promote discussion about what access to cheap goods really means. What is the price of that? If we actually allow our industries, for example, in the car industry or other industry to be kind of hollowed out again, really, by virtue of the fact that we want to import cheap Chinese electric vehicles? What about the risks to communities, the risks to jobs, and the risks to the welfare of our citizens? I mean, these are genuine and bona fide arguments that we need to have much more in public. And finally, I think we also need to own our own industrial policy to capitalize on things that we can manufacture and scale and create. It doesn't have to be a carbon copy of China's picking winners kind of policy, but we do need to help and nurture, I think, our own companies and jobs for the new digital and AI economy. So on the one hand, we have to take, I think, a much more streamlined and definitive view in terms of our trade with China. On the other hand, we have to kind of self-strengthen, as the Chinese might say, our own economy and industry.
George, thank you very much for that. Just all the agreements and arrangements that you laid out there on the East, the CPTPP, Gulf, India, China, all of that sort of thing, that only amounts to a fraction, does it, of our trade with Europe and America?
Yes. So, I mean, our trade with CPTPP countries is about 8% of our exports and imports. I mean, with the EU, I mean, it has gone down since 2016, but it's about 40%, 41% of our trade. With the United States, it's high teens, 18, 20%. So
there's and I was interested in your thing about the difference of adversaries and partners negotiating trade. Is China the big key case in this, or are there others that we have this adversary issue with?
Well, there is this kind of group that is sort of colloquially known as the CRINCs, right, which is China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. And there are a number of relatively poor countries that politically align quite closely with those four adversaries, as we might say. But China is really I mean, the bond between them really is there is only one, which is that they are all viscerally opposed to the United States and to Western values, etc., etc. But China is the giant amongst them.
Because can I give you a question? I'm not sure if you, from Margaret Barry. Which British export sectors are likely to face the steepest cultural and regulatory barriers in Asia?
Just to be clear, is this a question about which of the toughest countries in Asia to do business with, or which are ISIS? Well, okay, sorry, looking at the question on the screen now, I can see. Okay, so I think, I mean, in Asia, I mean, I don't think we have too many problems really doing business with Japan, Korea, and Singapore, which are in the kind of in the round, which are basically commonly accepted trade issues and subject to negotiation. But obviously, China, for example, has very, very particular, I mean, we don't have full reciprocity in our trade with China. There are many things that our companies are allowed to do only under very strict circumstances in China. Certainly allowed access to the AI and technology space in the way that China would like us to give them. So we have to be, which of the export sectors, basically, I would say they're predominantly really in things that the Chinese deem to be sensitive to national security, which is a list that for them and for us is getting broader and broader.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much for that. Please stay with us. We are now going to Dr. Amrita Saha, an economist with the Institute of Development Studies, and her work has received global media coverage, and her research feeds into governments, the UN, and other organizations. One of her specialities is South trade and inclusive growth, an issue being much debated in Britain, our quest for growth, although we are not part of the global South. But we are in a changing world. Amrita Saha, tell us what you know.
Thank you, Humphrey, and thank you for having me on today. I'd like to start by a statement, I guess, similar to what George has already said. The title of today, Britain Looks East. Any Look East strategy for trade for the UK should be complementary to what we do closer with the EU. So Asia-facing trade can, of course, help diversify demand, especially linking with Britain's industrial strategy and development policy, but it needs to go hand in hand with reducing frictions with Europe. I'd like to make two main points. The first is that, Britain's East strategy is clearly a diversification response. It is a response to slower goods export performance, rise of Asian demand, heightened geoeconomic risks. What have you got? But this began before the current trade strategy. So the 2021 integrated review framed this Indo-Pacific tilt. And in the refresh in 2023, we saw the region, kept central to UK interests. Since then, of course, UK has sought deeper links with this tilt, which go even beyond China and India, as some of the examples have been mentioned: UK, Japan, CEPA, accession to the CPTPP, also UK, Singapore Digital Economy Agreement, the UK-India FTA, of course, and the improved UK-South Korea FTA, which concluded just recently in 2025. The UK's 2025 trade strategy then embedded trade much more explicitly into growth, resilience, and industrial policy. So what one might argue is that, this Indo-Pacific tilt or Britain's Look East policy is no longer just a primarily diplomatic tilt. It is part of a more structured economic agenda. This Look East policy, when we look closely at the details, is very, very layered, and George has alluded to many of these points. China is, of course, one of the largest Eastern trade partner for the UK by value. This is dominated by goods imports, and of course, the UK has a very large goods deficit with China for the reasons already discussed. India is relatively smaller, but is a fastest sort of rising market, which presents major opportunities with UK exports to India, increasing quite quickly. And of course, this is heavily services led. Japan is strategically important, high income market. South Korea is smaller, but is really important for digital and also for automotive and pharma sectors. Singapore is also a large bilateral market. So this Look East policy is, of course, beyond China and is much more layered than is visible in the headlines. And my second point is, talking of headlines, in connection to these, increasing trade agreements, negotiations, what comes up in headlines is the possibility for increasing exports to support millions and millions of jobs. But if we just take a step back, the reality is that, if we look at the UK across regions, export exposure is very, very concentrated. And SMEs and businesses are struggling. Their SMEs are not easily able to absorb changes in fixed rate costs. If you look at some of the regions, of course, London and Southeast are structurally positioned to have the advantages from services heavy trade. So export supported jobs are largely, in and around London. And so this region would be very, well positioned to gain from that kind of services heavy trade growth with India or Singapore or Japan. Manufacturing regions, on the other hand, so if you look at West Midlands, East Midlands, Northeast, they are very exposed to goods trade with Eastern partners. And this is quite substantively appears to be in advanced manufacturing, presenting both opportunities and risks. Then we've got Scotland and Wales, which is much more affected through, let's say, food and drink or energy-linked goods, financial professional services. If you look at a very recent DBT, Department of Business and Trade analysis of the same sort of trade, jobs, and geography aspects, it's also clear that this local specialization means that not all parts of the country can exploit new trade opportunities equally and quickly. Low-skilled workers might face major input competition or affected by, those kind of shocks translating. So any sort of rapid eastward pivot could really widen pressure on exposed sectors in the UK, unless, of course, that East policy goes hand in hand together with investments in adjustment support, domestic capabilities, and much better regional targeting. So I think based on those 2 points, I'd really like to sort of underline that Britain's East strategy cannot just simply be judged by what we see in terms of headline aggregate export growth figures. I think we need to have a balanced view of which are the sectors that are likely to expand, which are the sectors that will benefit more or less due to connections with a local supply chain. So we need to kind of consider a more sort of combined policy package to really think carefully of trade and inclusive growth at the core of our Look East policy.
Thank you for that. That's a really interesting point. I mean, we're talking about Britain looking east, but is the British government or the companies also looking at an equal measure to Latin America and to Africa? And as if there are pots of gold there as well?
Interesting question. So is there equal pot of gold? I think time will tell. But I guess, there are, of course, expanding opportunities with Africa. UK has very close ties with, lots of African economies, Kenya, South Africa. So I think the main point here is that a Look East will not be a substitute for either reducing trade frictions with the EU or even trade with Africa. I think what we need to think about is UK's trade strategy linked closely with its industrial strategy and thinking about partnerships in that sort of connected lens. So trade with Africa would be, equally as important with as trade with expanding trade opportunities with East Asia. But keeping that sort of, sector focus in mind, and maybe having a more tailored, differentiated approach to different global regions.
It is what you're saying. I'm finding it fascinating. You talked about the headlines that weren't really, or explaining it in the wrong way. Is the British government nailing down this? Is it doing what you've suggested? Or is it doing what we're seeing more in the headlines? A politician goes out and signs a whiskey deal with Japan and everybody thinks everything's fantastic.
Well, the headlines, of course, speak to, politicized issues, what the public wants to hear. But I do think that, there is a lot of promise in what we've seen with the UK trade strategy. Given its focus on key growth sectors, given the emphasis on linking with industrial policy, we are no longer just talking of diplomatic tilts or diplomatic partnerships. I think we're thinking in terms of very structured economic agenda. But I think maybe connecting that better with what action looks like at the business level, because businesses, continue to report challenges. Businesses continue to report issues, for example, as a result of course, continuing frictions in terms of trade with EU. So I think if we match that ambition that we are seeing now at that strategy level better with how UK businesses want to be supported, I think that would be quite welcome.
Thank you so much for that. Before we go on to our final speaker, we're going to take a very short break and then back again. Welcome back, and our third panelist is Dr. Prachi Agarwal from the ODI Global Think Tank and has worked extensively on trade policy, regional trade agreements, and digital trade. Her research also drills down on determining the economic impact at country and city level, at the grassroots, in other words, against think tank theory. She's worked with the UN, the Asia Development Bank, and others, specifically analyzing global shocks on growth. So, Prachi Agarwal, Britain Looks East, Reorientating Trade Ties. Give us your thoughts.
Thank you, Humphrey, for the question and for having me on the panel. I think it's a very timely conversation to have. I think looking east should be understood as more than a narrow trade pivot. And I will end up drawing a little bit on what was said by the other panelists here. But it's more about how the UK positions itself in a world where economic influence, innovation, investment, and growth are increasingly concentrated across Asia and in the Indo-Pacific. So today, the UK is still working out its place in the world as a middle power, but it is also being pragmatic about securing market access, building resilient supply chains, and strengthening relationships in some of the fastest growing regions of the world. So given the geopolitical and the economic circumstances we find ourselves in, where tariffs are increasingly being used as a bargaining chip in foreign policy, where supply chains are vulnerable, and where the multilateral consensus system has been eroding, I think the UK is right to look east and diversify its economic partnerships. So this does not, as it was clearly said, this does not mean turning away from Europe or the US or its existing allies. It simply means reducing overdependence and widening commercial options, ensuring UK has strong economic relationships going into the future. And one of these key relationships I want to talk about today of this wider strategy is, of course, India. So the UK signed a free trade agreement, or an FTA, with India in July 2025, and Amrita has spoken about it a little bit, but I want to delve a little bit deeper. So the UK and India already have a very deep relationship. We know that there are massive overlaps in ideas, culture, food, innovation, as well as the need to promote businesses. And today, bilateral trade already stands about $50 billion. Pounds, my bad. And the FTA negotiations, which began 3 years ago, went through 15 grueling rounds, where the agreement is now finally going to come into force exactly 2 weeks from today, right, on the 15th of July. And this agreement, it's important to know that this agreement actually supports the UK government's plan for change and its ambitions to create more opportunities for UK businesses. So it also builds on UK's trade strategy substantially with the objective of sustainable, inclusive, resilient growth through trade. And it really it could really benefit the high-tech manufacturing sectors which are identified in UK's industrial policy as well, or industrial strategy. So for me, this particular agreement is a critical part of a strategy of looking east. And it is really important, and it's going to be it's sure to be mutually beneficial for the UK-India relationship that we see today. And it is about also recognizing that UK's long-term prosperity will depend on its ability to engage seriously with economies that are shaping the global south, right? And the global growth as well. So it is worth remembering that this FTA, and we've talked about some of this, that the headline figures say some things, and sometimes we tend to question whether this agreement or any agreement the UK is signing is going to be beneficial for its businesses, its investors, and its consumers. So I think it is worth remembering that an FTA, whenever negotiated, including the one with India, was not negotiated or signed on a whim. It's built over several years, and it's informed by businesses, by civil society groups, by trade unions, public bodies, and individuals like you and me, who have contributed to the consultation process. So this matters because trade agreements need to work for the people it is for, and it cannot simply be an agreement. It needs to work for consumers, for workers, for smaller businesses, and as well as other regions that exist in whether in the UK or in India. So in the long run, it is estimated that this agreement is going to increase trade by about £25 billion, benefiting both India and UK by about $5 billion each. And these are not just numbers, right? These mean real gains. It is sorry, can you hear me?
Yes.
I think I lost network.
No, I can hear you, and You haven't even flickered on our screen, so please carry on. It's fascinating.
All right, thank you. Sorry about that. I don't think this is a quick fix for Britain's growth challenges. I think it's a long-term platform for investment, for trade, and deeper commercial links. So there are clear opportunities that we've talked about, but the main sectors are the advanced manufacturing sectors that are going to benefit. So we're talking about chemicals, we're talking about cosmetics, about pharmaceuticals, beverages, and motor vehicles. So for example, one short example is for cars, for example. Indian tariff rates are very high. They're at 110%. And they are going to go down to about 10% with the quota, though. This is going to be significant commercial opening for the UK businesses. And these benefits are going to build over time. So, UK consumers will also benefit from this. I mean, they're going to see lower prices for some Indian textiles, clothing, and footwear. And I know this question was brought forward before, that is this going to be really beneficial for UK consumers? Are prices actually going to fall? It's not a direct relationship, but it will be interesting to see exactly what happens in the next coming years. I also think it's really important not to get too caught up with the headline figures, such as, the UK is reducing tariffs on 99% of its goods on its lines, and India is only going to do it for about 85 to 90%. The more important question, and I think this is the crux of my argument, is that can businesses actually use the preferences that are provided by the agreement? I think that's where the real gains are. A tariff preference through an FTA is only valuable if a business knows how to use it. If they understand the rules of origin, they can complete the documentation, they can navigate customs procedures without, excessive costs or delays. So we've seen, especially for the UK, we've seen some uneven preference utilization rates in the past. So the UK has different agreements, different FTAs, and it's not always been very high. So for example, for Vietnam, the FTA, the preference utilization is only about 48%. But if you look at other agreements like South Korea, it's about 91%. So this tells us that signing an FTA is only the beginning of this conversation. The real work is in the implementation. And for this agreement to succeed, I think the most important thing is going to be that both governments need to make it easy for firms, especially smaller firms, to use it. That means simpler customs procedures, reduce administrative burdens, clear information on rules of origin, on practical support through workshops and trainings, especially making sure these trainings are accessible. They're available in various languages, local languages. And moving beyond goods, I think we've talked about the services sector already, so I'm not going to go too much into it. But it is important to remember that the agreement gives UK businesses greater certainty in one of Asia's fastest growing markets. The key term being certainty, right? So companies such as Barclays, HSBC, Unilever, Vodafone, GSK, others already have long-standing links with the Indian market. And I expect these relationships to deepen with certainty in the Indian market with the agreement in place. But central to all of this is going to be the implementation plan for smaller businesses and for women and youth. So for example, smaller businesses need practical information. Simple things like where does demand exist, how to obtain licenses. So the license system in India can be quite confusing. It is not very straightforward. So, we need to standardize that. The agreement may help with that. Even knowing what standards apply and how do we deal with trade procedures, right? That's going to be very important. So only if large companies are benefiting, that's not really benefit for anybody. We need the smaller companies to benefit. And I also want to quickly take a minute to point towards the potential impact on women, which has been the central, core of my research when it comes to free trade agreements and regional agreements. Trade and gender, the agreement has a trade and gender chapter, which is significant because it recognizes the systemic barriers that women face in participating in trade and different roles women play in the economy. It includes commitments around women's access to markets, trade finance, information, all very important things. It also addresses workplace discrimination and unpaid care work, which usually the burden falls disproportionately on women. And these are very important barriers to their economic participation. So I think there's a practical question here. Women entrepreneurs need targeted help, just as do SMEs. They need, access to information. And without that kind of support, I think many businesses will find it very difficult to access this FTA. And this is perhaps the case for several agreements that the UK will sign with the Global South. And businesses in the UK, especially women-owned businesses and SMEs, will need access to that information. We are forgetting that it is important to remember that this is not a social or an inclusive argument that I'm making. I think it's a very economic argument. It's a business case. We are saying that 50% of the population are women, and we need to make sure they are going to be part of this process. They're going to benefit and they can participate. So I think the UK-India agreement could work really well if it's implemented properly and used widely. And the geopolitical case for looking east is clear. The UK needs to be present in these regions. And India is a very important part of the picture. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm taken by this, you've repeated a few times that it needs to work. So whatever is in the headlines there needs to be felt at the grassroots there. And given our carousel of prime ministers that we've had in Britain, mainly around the lack of growth, when will we see it? How long will it take to work, given everything that we've discussed today? Are we talking about decades or years or what?
Very good question, I think, and I think important one as well. Any such agreements, and given the political environment we're in the UK and elsewhere, I think it's important to remember that the benefits from such an agreement are going to start coming in perhaps in a decade. So even within the agreement, for example, the UK is on 15 July, 99% of UK's tariffs are going to go down. But for India, the case is that it's going to go down very slowly. So for example, UK businesses can access the Indian market over the next 10 years. It's not going to happen immediately. And automatically that means that it's going to take time for businesses to learn how to work with this FTA. They could to learn how to do the documentation, how to make sure that we are working together. We're sharing best practices. Whether that's on inclusion, whether that's on labor, whether that's on environmental impact. All of these things we'll have to learn. We'll have to wait and learn how we can work together. And you are rightly pointed out, this might take some time. And
sorry, I said it takes a decade. That gives us another 5 more prime ministers, I guess, before we get it right. Can I open up to the floor, George, on the needs to work thing? Do you agree with that decade before? And we've had a decade since Brexit anyway, so we're going to be talking about 20 or 30 years.
Yeah, I mean, trade agreements take a long time to come. When I say come to fruition, I mean the agreements can be drawn up, but before people get used to the idea of new arrangements and how to exploit markets and take advantage and so on, I mean, it does take time. I don't really have a strong view about how long, whether it's 0 to 5 years or 5 to 10. I mean, the main point is, I think that we probably will have, we'll see firm level benefits starting to accrue to companies in this country, for example, probably also in India as well. Much earlier than we'll see any sort of significant economic repercussions. And in fact, just building on kind of comments I made at the beginning, I'm quite skeptical that we will see major macroeconomic repercussions, to be honest.
Right.
They may be that much more significant at the margin in India than they're likely to be perhaps in China, because because the tariff reductions will be meaningful over time, relatively speaking, and there's much more catch up that can take place there, because obviously we've been trying, or British companies and Western companies have been trying to penetrate the Chinese market for quite a long time. So yeah, I think it is a time-consuming thing, but I don't think anybody should start.
And all of this, of course, is if I get Amrita Saha, all of this, of course, is, as all three of you have said, it's just a fraction of the trade that we already have with the EU and North America.
Yeah, so I mean, I think I would agree with most of the points that have been made about, trade agreements needing to work and they take time.
So when you disagree with, we'd like to hear that.
I was just going to say that, but in addition, I think what we might see quickly, and that's really a hope than a forecast, is the benefits from certainty. I think, Prachi already mentioned this, that the certainty that a trade agreement brings would be, I think, quite beneficial, and that lays the path down for more tangible aggregate benefits that we then see down the line.
Okay.
And sorry, that's my point. Thank you.
Oh, okay. So I just wanted, there's a couple of questions that come in here that I'd like to give to everybody. A couple on supply chains. Philip Bowman, what supply chain protections does this shift eastwards offer against the kinds of global shocks we've recently been experiencing? And linked to that, Peter Cornish says, how could supply chain distances increasing UK's carbon footprints be countered? So one on crises and one on climate there. Prachi, Agarwal, a very brief thought on those two.
Yeah, about the climate thing, I think the government impact assessment studies are saying that we're going to see a long-term increase in UK emissions because of these agreements. I don't know the exact numbers, but it's definitely going to increase. And that is why most of the times, and as it is the case now, FTAs are paired with sector-specific, decarbonization measures, green logistics and sustainability monitoring built into it. So especially for several sectors such as textiles and manufacturing, where climate emissions are only going to increase. So I think these agreements, although are going to lead to higher emissions, I think they're also going to give us opportunities to explore more supply chains where perhaps we will be able to find more mitigation solutions or adaptation solutions to climate as well. Yeah.
Okay. Can I do one's coming from Anil Batra? George, perhaps you, how might this change to the East change UK-EU trade dynamics? This change to the East and UK-EU trade dynamics?
Well, again, I want to kind of contextualize this, because actually, we're talking a lot here about trade relations that the UK might or might not, or might evolve with countries in Asia and the Middle East, for example, as though we were still in this kind of hyper-globalization period that we've had for the last 20 or 30 years. Of course, that's patently not the case. And I think, when I referred earlier to sort of global fracturing, I actually think that will be the order of the day. I mean, I don't really see any shift away from that for the foreseeable future. So we will have, the world is kind of breaking down really into blocks. There's a sort of an America-leaning block, not always necessarily allies that are kind of rock solid, behind each other, but basically, most of the world's GDP, most of the world's asset market capitalization, most of the world's wealth, most of the world's exports and investment basically take place within this America-leaning bloc. It's going to be much more difficult for this bloc to trade and much more complicated for this bloc to trade with what we might call the China-leading bloc, which will have a majority of the world's population and perhaps the majority of the world's production, because that's manufacturing production, because that's predominantly China. But there's there's not much trade actually takes place between the two blocks. Most of it is within the bloc. And so countries like India and, for example, obviously sit with a group of countries that have traditionally been non-aligned, almost promiscuous, you might say, because they like to kind of side with one side, on some things, on the other side on something else.
Is there a non-aligned bloc, or is that the global south?
I mean, I think there is. There's no such thing as the global south as such, right? I mean, it's a term that we use to pigeonhole all countries that are not, quote, Western liberal democracies. And there's nothing really that binds the global South except that not even all of them are in the South. You know, India's in the North.
It's true. We're running out of time, George. I just want to put your points to Prachi Agarwal. Do you agree with George on that? The blocks?
I think so. I think it has been summed up very well. So yeah, I'm not going to try to add more to that.
Okay. Amrita Saha, anything?
Yeah, I mean, maybe I can just add to that argument. I think, UK, I think, stands in a position where it, is able to, I think, have a diplomatic tilt to different regions. I think we need to sort of carefully think of this, maybe sort of, more discipline to the diversification that we seek across all these different blocks.
Okay, thank you very much. Stay with us because I'm going to come back for a final thought, but now we're going to go to the chair of the Democracy Forum, Barry Gardiner, MP, who in a former job was our shadow international trade secretary. Barry, you've been listening in. Have you learned anything?
Yes, look, thank you to our three panelists, and certainly, and also to Charles, who set us off admirably, just mentioning Amrita's discussions in London and highlighted the figures, the 285 billion worth of trade that's now being done by the UK with Asia and the Gulf. I suppose if I were to say what I would have liked more out of this discussion is not simply to look at it as what's happening with our shift or our looking to the east, but also to see how we fit in with their plans, their investment strategies, their trade strategies. And I think recently India just developed 87 billion worth of MOUs for trade with the GCC. So they are shifting their trade patterns as well, and I think one of the interesting things would be to try and join up those two so we can see what the total impact is. Look, George Magnus, I thought gave a wonderful cautionary note to start us off with when he said, look, you just can't substitute EU trade with Asia. It's not compatible. We got the figures, 40% of our trade having been with the EU. It's trade gravity, and that's what we all understand. You do most trade with those who are nearest to you. It's inevitable, but it's a really salient lesson that I thought he drew out from that, talking about what is the value over and above simply the economic value of that trade, and that was where he said, look, to build geopolitical influence through that trade engagement. I think that's a really, really important point to understand. I thought he made that brilliantly. He said, look, India and Gulf have much more to offer. He said of that was rather than CPTPP, which is, as he said, 0.1% of per annum that we will get in terms of our increase in trade there. He then sort of focused really on China and again made a superb point about the difference between a trade competitor and an adversary. Yes, with a competitor, you negotiate often about the changing priorities that you have, the commercial priorities that you have, but with a potential adversary, trade is about strategic advantage. And again, really critical point for anybody dealing with trade, anybody who's understanding what these negotiations really are about. He talked about China's exports 50% up, but imports static. And really this whole need to understand what China is doing to position itself strategically, geopolitically, the self-reliance that it has, and the way in which their trade with us can be used simply to undermine our capacity, how it can damage jobs, how it can, if we only focus in trade negotiations about what is going to be best for the consumer, and yes, there is always a trade-off between our consumers and our producers in this country, and sometimes you lean in one direction, sometimes in another, to get a balanced agreement at negotiations. But critically, with China, what we're looking at is the undermining of strategically important areas. Now, we at the Democracy Forum have talked about this many times before, about rare earth metals, rare earth productions, and also, of course, steel, which is heavily subsidized in China, being able to flood foreign markets and undermine their domestic production. Strategically vital for defense. So I thought these were excellent points. He talked about HSBC and the bank supporting China's national security law in Hong Kong. And so he raised the issues around human rights, how they should be factored into trade agreements, and talked about the careful use of dual use equipment. All of these things are really important when you're considering trading with a potential adversary rather than simply a trade competitor. And of course, I think that whole sense of looking to the wider dimensions of trade was actually brilliantly picked up by Prachi Agarwal, Dr. Agarwal, when she talked about the importance of women in trade and how that came into focus. But moving on, Amrita Saha talked about how Asia can help us diversify demand, but how it needed to go hand in hand, this look east needed to go hand in hand with a genuine industrial strategy. And the trade strategy must be about growth, industrial strategy policy in the UK, and the look east must be part of that wider agenda, not something that is seen as running in parallel with it. She spoke about the increase in exports to support jobs, but quite rightly said that businesses are struggling and manufacturing is less able to take advantage of that look east. The strategy can't just be judged in growth figures, but by thinking of what sectors should be advantaged. So a really important lesson for a new government coming in terms of its trade policy. We're looking to a new Burnham administration, it seems, in this country. And it's going to be really important, particularly, I think, as the talk in those areas around Burnham is about regionalization, devolution, local municipal Manchesterism, if you like. But that's going to have a real implication that there is coordination there. We're going to have to see that coordinated in terms of a trade strategy. And whether those areas we're looking in terms of sectoral dominance in different areas, how that's connected up with our industrial policy, our energy policy particularly, and the growth that we want to engender. So I think some really important points there. Dr. Agarwal talked about innovation, investment and growth, the UK securing its position in a new trade environment where tariffs are a weapon, where the rules-based order is fragmenting. And then spoke really powerfully, I thought, about the Indian Free Trade Agreement. I can never understand why it's coming into effect on the 15th of July. It seems to me it should have been, what is it, the 15th of August, which is the Indian Independence Day. that would have been a much better date for its coming into force. But she pointed out that actually what is currently 50 billion should actually increase by 25 billion. That's a big 50% uplift in trade if we can achieve it. And she talked about sustainable growth to benefit UK high-tech companies, and quite rightly said that the FTA must work for all sectors of society, for consumers, for workers, and everyone, not just for advanced businesses. But she highlighted the advanced manufacturing centres, motor, cosmetics, pharma, and I thought, again, a very interesting point that she made, that a tariff preference is only useful if business knows how to use it. And therefore training our businesses, particularly our small businesses, in tariff utilization, how to navigate customs, how to deal with the SBS rules, the licensing rules. These are really critical things. And concluded with her plea, I think it was, to see the importance of gender sectors in the trade agreements as being vitally important for the economy. It's really important for women to have access to markets, access to finance, and that be seen as an economic case and not a rights-based case as such. A quick plug, 2018, the Just Trading initiative that I launched at the WTO 8 years ago, I was heartened to find that many of the things that I recommended in there were actually amplified by your speakers today. And so naturally, I thought they made excellent points. Thank you very much.
Barry, thank you. Thank you very much for that. I just want to go back to the panel for a final thought. And there's also that thing that Barry gave us, is that where exactly does Britain fit into what Asia wants? But George Magnus, very quickly, Britain looks east. Your final thoughts.
Okay, to end on a slightly more optimistic note, since I've been a bit of a sourpuss on some of these things. I mean, and somebody asked a question about supply chains, which obviously are in a bit of a sort of a kaleidoscope at the moment, right? We don't really know how all of this is going to kind of settle back, and lots of discussion about, de-risking and decoupling and so on. I think one of the things that kind of jumps out at me about global fracturing really is how supply chain structures are going to change. Okay, they may change more slowly than we might think, and that the closure may take much longer. But for example, at some point in the not too distant future, we will be producing many more rare earths and processing them in countries that we regard as friendly, rather than being under Chinese control. And a lot of companies, including Chinese companies that are leaving China or producing elsewhere in Asia to avoid tariffs or to simplify, trading relationships, are changing the picture of supply chains involving countries like Vietnam and Indonesia and India and Thailand, for example. So these are things which they want. You asked I think Barry asked the question about what is it that Asian countries want actually out of trade. They want to do different things, and we should be very alert to all of this and see where we might be able to slot into that too.
Thank you very much. Amrita Saha, your final thoughts.
Thank you. No, I'd like to end by saying that, I think new partnerships, new alliances are more important than ever as we look at trade, embedded together with security, resilience. But the UK, as well as I think all partners, be it Asia, Africa, these are no longer diplomatic tilts or diplomatic partnerships alone. All countries are pursuing these partnerships as part of more structured, well thought out economic agendas. So I think what Barry said is really useful. We in the UK can think of what we are doing, but we need to also align with how other countries are taking action.
Yes, I think that's a good point. Prachi, Agarwal, finish us off. Your final thoughts.
Yes, last statement, I usually, signing trade agreements is usually the first step to stronger trade and economic ties. And the real work begins right after that, is to translate from text and intent into action and real economic impact. And I think UK agreements to the, with the East countries is not a cure for Britain's growth problems, nor is it just a symbolic pivot to Asia. It's a long-term strategic platform, and its success will be measured not by the chapters and tariffs, but more by whether firms beyond London, especially SMEs and women-owned businesses, can actually use it. I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. What a fascinating discussion. Thank you, everybody. George Magnus, Amrita Saha, Prachi, Agarwal, and thank you all at the Democracy Forum for making this really important debate unfold. Our next Democracy Forum debate is July the 14th, Energy Security in a Warming World, Perspectives from the Global South, that George Magnus says doesn't exist. So please join us then. And until then, thank you, everybody, and goodbye.
The Democracy Forum is a not-for-profit organisation founded in 2009 under the patronage of Baroness Nicholson of Winterbourne. Its principal goal was to work for the furtherance of democracy, peace and the rule of law in order to counter religious fundamentalism and intolerance in our global communities. In an increasingly fractured world, this goal continues to be the driving force behind all of the Forum's activities. Lord Charles Bruce is the current president of the Forum. Since its inception, the Forum has hosted and co-hosted seminars on a wide variety of topics relating to democracy and human rights across the world. The Democracy Forum encourages academics, students, journalists and other socially and politically conscious people to attend our seminars and to participate in the question and answer session. Details are available on our website, thedemocracyforumlimited.com.